All right. Hopefully we won't have any more terrible AV issues. Up next is a personal best friend of mine and an inspiration to me, Matthew, the Rhodes Scholar Rogers.
Really brief introduction. I like it. So this talk will be on getting newcomers into information security, though I'll probably call it cybersecurity for the rest of the talk. I just knew it's the new fad is calling it cyber. But thanks for coming to my talk, those of you who came. I know I highly recommend you check out, since Adrian is recording all of these, Arnar and Paul's talks. I know they'll be good. I've seen them at a couple conferences, and they're always great. And yeah, so we'll be talking about how to get people into security through the lens of a security club that I've been running along with a friend of mine named Jeremy Lochner for the last couple years at Auburn University, because there have been some problems with it, and we're trying to avoid those. So one of my main inspirations for this talk is, I did a lot of cons when I was younger, like later high school, and people kept coming up to me and going, "Hey, you're into cyber stuff, that's cool. How do I get my kids into it?" And I really didn't have a good answer because I tried to relate my own story of how I got into cybersecurity, and it's just sort of a lot of fortunes of circumstance and a lot of bad cases for like general advice. Additionally, I've been running this security club for the last 3 years, and I've heard a few people say, there's too many talks about success in the cyber industry. It feels like people. They don't get that it's discouraging to newcomers because they don't feel all the failures that we're all doing. And I went, I've got my fair share of screwing up a lot, so I can do that. So the outline will be quickly about how I got into cybersecurity, the different types of security clubs that I see being possible, and then me, screwing up Capture the Flag team, screwing up a security club. You get the idea, and then wrapping it up. A little bit about myself. I originally got into cybersecurity through a competition called CyberPatriot. If you're not familiar with that, I'll go into it a little bit later. Co-founded the Ethical Hacking Club at Auburn, as we tended to call it. I've got a bit of previous speaking experience in cybersecurity education for Huntsville City Schools, and a bit of a background in work with doing a lot of like malware analysis and reverse engineering. And I graduated about a month ago from Auburn with a degree in software engineering. So pretty fresh out, but got a lot of experience with this education stuff. So a quick aside about CyberPatriot. Basically what it does is it's a competition for high schoolers and middle schoolers. And it teaches things like OS hardening, digital forensics, and a lot of like general networking, using Cisco primarily. And then, again, mostly for high schoolers, that's when I competed, but there's a lot of middle school competitions, and I think they're trying to expand down to even elementary school at some levels now. As a mentor, I'd encourage all of you to try and be mentors if you have the time. It's one of those things where my team ended up doing quite well in CyberPatriot. We got second nationally the first year we competed, and then we got first nationally the next year. And it's one of those things where we are fortunate to be from Huntsville, Alabama, which has a lot of defense contractors and thus a lot of people doing cybersecurity, and people at the time to come and mentor us at our high school. And it's really just not the same getting it online, and I'd recommend, help people out if you get a chance. You get some benefits. They sign you up for Microsoft Imagine, aka DreamSpark is what it used to be called, and you get free legitimate Windows images from that, from like Windows Server 2008 R1 on, full keys, licenses, pretty convenient. And hopefully if you're attending this talk, you get some sense of satisfaction from teaching the next generation about cybersecurity. Hopefully that's a thing you're into. If not, this talk might be a little weird, but suffer through it. And then to give you an idea of the competition, finals is defending 8 boxes that are running critical services. Of course, all of those boxes have a plethora of backdoors and stuff already built into them from an active red team, and doing your best. So the types of clubs that I see are really 3. So you can do a competitive Capture the Flag team, which requires finding people with a decent baseline of knowledge, works fairly well, and there's a lot of benefits to it. You can do future cybersecurity professionals, people who you see going into different areas inside the cybersecurity domain. And the really people you can recruit for that kind of organization are people who are already planning to go into cybersecurity, or those that are undecided in their career fields. So for a lot of this talk, I'll be referencing teaching students, though it certainly doesn't have to be that way. You can teach anybody who's interested at all. If you run an organization, you can be teaching grandmothers about cybersecurity so they're more aware and they can teach their friends. So that fits into the last category, which is making people more aware of cybersecurity, which means literally anybody. And the point of those is to sort of change the mentality of regular people about security from thinking, oh, it's this great hindrance, it's another box I have to type in, it's another thing I have to do, to something that they see as a public good and utility, so they're less annoyed when they're going through it, and thus they're a more active user. So each of these produces a different set of skills. Firstly, you've got your CTFs, which produce, if you're not familiar with the general categories for most of these things, you got reverse engineering, web exploitation, crypto, that's cryptography, not cryptocurrency, stego, some miscellaneous stuff, and then like binary exploitation. And generally you have to be pretty specialized for running these clubs, and it's kind of one of the downfalls of them, is that inherently in order to do well at any of these, to the point where if you ideally want to make money in them, you have to be really specialized to get a lot of those later problems and be teams that are very successful. And it's hard to have that skill set on your own as a person if you're just one person founding one of these organizations. For security, you can teach them sysadmin, OS hardening, general best practices, some networking, and then probably whatever the specialty of the speaker is. This field is so broad that if you can teach everything, kudos to you, but most of us can't. And that will probably result in a pretty broad knowledge set. And then for general security, if you're just trying to teach people about security fundamentals, you'll get stuff like, basic cyber hygiene, the idea of like security as layers, some networking, and then the attack and defense thought process. And the goal here is that you apply security to whatever they end up doing, right? These aren't going to be, IT people. They're not going to be penetration testers. They're not going to be doing DFIR. They're just, oh, well, I'm a chemical engineer and I'm interested in this, or I'm a developer and I'm interested in this. Or, it could be anything really. Maybe you just work it for a small business, and being security conscious is something that's ideal. And I want to stress that when I say cyber hygiene, I really don't mean the kind of one-liners that we tend to throw it as an industry all of the time. Change your password every so often. Don't write things on notepads. Security, or defending is really hard because there's they have to get right 1,000 times, and the red team has to only get it right once. Stuff like that. These really common mantras that we say to people and then don't really explain all of that well. That's not helpful. If your goal for this, I think it should be, is to make it so that users are no longer the weak part of the chain for your networks, right? Users, if trained properly, can be an actual benefit to your network. They're another layer of security and another set of eyes that you can't just have as an IT staff, because you don't have the time to work through all of your network, and you don't have the entire knowledge set of it either. So it's important to have your users being well trained, and certainly a once a year cybersecurity awareness seminar isn't the way to do it. But if you can talk to them like they're real adults and convince them, yes, security is important and this is why, then they're not just going to be useful for a small period of time afterwards, but you can explain to them that as technology evolves, this is why security is important, and this is how you do it, and this is the thought process. So if you have a CTF club, you've got pretty advanced people. Regular security, fine, but general security, it's a pretty diversive group. As for the pitch to sort of get people interested in cybersecurity, if you're trying to do that, it really does depend on the area. For example, I'm from Huntsville, Rocket City, known for NASA. We have Redstone Arsenal right there, so we have a lot of defense contractors in the Army. So maybe pitch about why it's important for NASA, or maybe from more of a national security perspective. Of course, if you're getting people who are new to security in general, their only preconception of what this field is what they've seen in stuff like CSI Cyber. And because of that, offensive stuff is going to be pretty entertaining for them. And everything else is, oh my God, you just stare at a terminal all day? Is that what you people do? Like, it would probably be kind of boring. And it's just kind of how it is. Ideally, 1995 hackers, but real life. But in cyber, this buzzword, it's too broad to succinctly summarize all of these careers in it, and it's really hard to give this pitch. And, you can always say money, and that's sort of a pitch, but ideally you have people who really care about security and protecting the privacy of their users and all of the people that their job encompasses. You wouldn't want to tell people to become a doctor for the money. You'd ideally do it because they care about the people they're helping, and I think security should be the same way. And of course, with recent news, it's a lot easier to pitch cyber. Equifax, Yahoo, just to name a few, it becomes a lot easier to give these pitches. So to start using Auburn as an example, at Auburn, we've got a general student pool of mostly computer science students. The beginners being, they know some Java, they can't use a terminal, and they've never used Linux or any sort of virtual machine. And intermediate, they're a couple years into maybe their computer science degree. They maybe know some Python. They can maybe navigate around a Linux system because they've taken an operating systems class. But they don't really know any networking concepts. And this is pretty common around computer science programs around the country, is that networks is taught last in the curriculum, not first. So it's kind of hard to teach a lot of the security ideas without some sort of fundamental understanding of how computers communicate. And that's a big hurdle that'll often come up. But really, that's it. You don't have any advanced cybersecurity people. There's a couple here and there, but in general, that's really what you've got. And we had a few members from other engineering departments, but it was mostly computer science students. So our first attempt was to create this thing called AU-CTF. We were basically just making a capture the flag team. Essentially, my friend and I came from high school where we were competing in CyberPatriot, and there's this alternative called CCDC for colleges. And we said, oh, wouldn't that be great? Let's make our own team and compete. And we got to Auburn thinking, oh, surely this will already exist. It's this big thing in our high school. It didn't exist at all. So we were like, oh, okay, fine. We'll just start one. No big deal. Surely that will be an easy task. And then 3 years flew by. But, when we started, we said, oh, okay, let's just do capture the flag competitions. We'll get some people. Surely there'll be enough of them. And it'll be easy. That wasn't the case at all. So we ended up not really finding a good audience for CTFs. A, because a lot of people find them boring. They're sort of masochistic in nature, in my opinion, and not that many people enjoy them. They're useful for educational purposes, but to get people who are willing to spend their entire weekend working for like 48 hours straight on a competition that they probably won't win and get anything out of, but a sense of satisfaction, it's kind of a hard pitch, I would say. But if you are interested in making one of these organizations and you're dealing with people who don't have any experience at all, Pico-CTF is designed for high schoolers. It's up all the time. There's write-ups for literally every single one of them on there. And it's a really good primer, and I'd highly recommend it for teaching people. And if you already do CTFs, I'm sure you're aware of ctftime.org. It's good for finding write-ups and CTFs to compete in. And this is really how you build a knowledge base. But the issue is, if you're working from no knowledge base to begin with, and I mean, we're in college, we have some work experience behind us, but we're definitely not experts. So we can't teach them all of these skills without doing a ton of background research ourselves. And when you're already in college yourself, and a lot of you have, I'm sure all of you have jobs, trying to find the time to manage and do all of this without committing, 40 hours a week can be quite difficult. So we pivoted. We said, okay, well, CTFs are really good for teaching concepts, if nothing else, because essentially a CTF is just a compartmentalized problem of a specific ideal. So let's just do that. So we'd use Google Forms to get feedback from everybody, and we started giving these weekly talks based off, stealing from different conferences and what we thought was cool, or just different problems that we've come across and found interesting. But we only had about 10 people, so everything was kind of running smoothly. We were pretty happy. But then stuff happened. So we were running this club for about a year at this point, and honestly, our core audience at first was just the digital forensics class at Auburn. Because what they would end up doing is they'd be doing stuff like setting up Kali, analyzing PCAP files, learning memory forensics, and that's what we were doing too, except like a week in advance to their class, just sort of circumstantially. And we'd be getting feedback from them, and they'd go, well, I think we're about to cover this in the class, so can you guys cover it first? And that was a lot of our early meetings, was just helping teach a class. But the next year rolls around, we've got a bit of experience, and we think we know what we're doing. We were fools. And as we're going through it, suddenly 40 members show up to our first meeting. Our lab that we're actually teaching this stuff in like a little seminar room, is actually so full that people are having to stand along the walls. And we give our usual pitch at that point, which is, this is what people do in the security field, cool. And we'd go over a bunch of different types of CTF problems as sort of a round robin, because we were still kind of interested in this idea of running a team. And we tell them not to break laws because we're housed in Auburn University, and please don't run everything on the public Auburn Wi-Fi. Thanks. But at this point, we were really stressed out. It was a big concern as to how we were actually going to do this. And it didn't work out. After the first meeting, there were about 20 people left. And after that, there were about 10 people left. And we kind of plateaued from there. So what frightened everyone off? Well, first of all, we set up a virtual machine. It was really scary. And then we opened a terminal. And then we did some demos of CTF problems. And the thing is that they had no experience whatsoever in any of this. So we were essentially typing black magic words into a box. The box was responding. And we were somehow solving problems that they didn't know enough conceptually to even understand that why it was a thing we were doing. basically we went way too fast from 0 to 100 in their minds from lesson 1. And this was a huge problem. They didn't understand enough, so they didn't have any confidence that if they kept attending meetings that they would learn anything. In reality, our goal was, let's show them a little bit of everything and then we'll expand on whatever they're interested in. But in showing them that broad spectrum, they were immediately terrified and go, I don't think I've got this. So they backed out, because we're dealing with mostly college students here, right? So their time is both poorly managed and precious, which is a terrible combo. And we have to deal with that. And this is also a good point to bring up. Around midterms or so, or finals, if you're dealing with college students or just like any student, your membership is just going to tank because they're studying, and again, poor time management skills, even though we would host a meeting 1 hour a week. So the next semester rolls around, we're like, all right, we're ready. We're going to host like 40 people again. It's not going to be a problem. General advice, don't botch the kickoff. Change the meeting last minute, and nobody showed up. And of course, once you miss the first couple meetings, it's really hard to get into it. Again, we scared people off by opening some terminals and just typing some stuff into them. So strong attendance, imagine trying to catch people up from when you've been teaching slowly after a while. If somebody just shows up, trying to force all of that knowledge down their throat so they can catch up to speed and be, comfortable in your normal meetings is quite difficult. And of course, you can try to do meetings that are episodic, but the nature of security is that it builds on top of each other. Good luck doing anything if you don't know Bash, and of course if you're going through tools and stuff like that, you need to know networking basics. So if you don't know how that works, good luck. If you don't know enumeration, how are you going to go around and find networks if you're trying to exploit them? And it just sort of builds on top of each other until you're asking so many questions that you really don't know what to do, and then they give up. So another year rolls around, we're still running this thing, and suddenly we have 70 people at our first meeting. And, they're more ambitious freshmen this year, and we've got a good group of people who, we start slowly, we give the talk about why security is important in the different careers, and then we don't do a bunch of CTF problems, because we don't do that anymore, and because we've learned better. And we start slowly, and we try to encourage these people to learn, and they actually start sticking around. Within it's been 6 weeks, we have a meeting every week, and we still have 70 people showing up every week. Pretty good. But the issue is, at this point, we were trying to do more demos, and now we have 70 people, and good luck troubleshooting 70 people who don't really know what they're doing all at once. Every meeting, the first meeting, we'd always ask, hey, anybody with Linux experience, would you mind raising your hand? And we'd have 5 people. And it's just hard to work with when you're starting with those fundamentals. So our goal became teaching cybersecurity so that when these, mostly computer science students, develop, it'll always be in the back of their mind during design. Because the goal here is to make people who are not cybersecurity experts per se, but they're at least conscious of cybersecurity and its impacts on whatever they're doing and whatever career field they go into. But we're mostly dealing with computer science students here, so that was our main goal. So how do we go about doing this? Well, firstly, we'd always start with recent security news because it's a pretty easy way to ground the rest of your talk. Whatever you're doing, if you start with like an Equifax or some vulnerability or maybe a Talos report came out that week, it will show that these things you're teaching them and these things you're demoing are real and in the wild, and that cybersecurity is becoming this more advanced thing. But a key note here is that you don't really want to fearmonger. It's really easy in security to, especially if you're talking about something like critical infrastructure systems, it's all going to get hacked, the power grid's going to be shut off, we're all going to die. Cybersecurity is this hopeless endeavor, and this quickly leads to security nihilism, which I like to think we all have a little bit of in all of us, which is basically this thought that security is useless and, it's inevitable that somebody's going to break in. It's that one-liner that defense is hard and you have to be right 1,000 times when red team only has to be right once. But that's not really true. And as security, gets better, it becomes more about how can the red team become undetected, and you have a million opportunities as a blue team to detect them, right? Thinking in these more optimistic terms, especially when you're dealing with new people who are going into cybersecurity, right? It's like before when all of these members who had just got in and they didn't have the technical knowledge beforehand, when we went up to them and started trying to talk to them and teach them all of these, security concepts, they said, whoa, I don't know enough of the basics yet. This is too hard for me. I'm bailing. But if you start with security and you say, hey, security is this really hard game. It's impossible to win. Defending is this nightmarish task, and good luck. when they become users in their networks, when they become these people that you have to interact, that are interacting with your systems, they won't think, yeah, security is really important. They'll think, man, security is really hard and it's just hopeless no matter what. So why do I need to become an active, engaged user? Why do I need to try really hard? And that's just not productive. In reality, you want them to become one of the stronger links in your network, and they can help protect you in the future. And this will benefit not just you, but anywhere they go when they work. And we did this through something we call teaching through doing. So our core fundamental concept is this. We're working with students. Lectures are really boring. They get lectured at every day. Why are we going to just sit up here and lecture at them like I'm doing to you right now, constantly, right? Surely this is boring. And we'll come back to this later. But what we would do every semester is we would start with teaching them enumeration and basic networking, because the idea was we would eventually start teaching them about attack vectors, and by knowing how an attacker thinks, and the idea of like how hackers go from, instead of being an engineer and putting stuff together, which is what a lot of them understood, how do you take a system and understand it so well that you can break it apart in a way that the original maker didn't intend it? And that thought process is important, I would say, no matter what you do, especially if you're an engineer like a lot of these people are, because it gives them a different way to think about all of the problems that they're being given. So we said, well, if we teach them that thought process, then that will help them no matter what they do, and they can also take that and apply it to security and whatever they do. So we would set up a network with a ton of vulnerable boxes, just grab them from VulnHub or set up some ourselves. And then we would start by telling our members, after teaching them some basics, hey, come and go in this 3-hour period. We're just going to sit in this lab. We're going to write some notes on a whiteboard. Here's, we started slow, so at this point they kind of know Bash. They know what they're doing a little bit. They've learned some enumeration. And we go up to them and go, just show up. We'll help you out, but sit down and go at it. Just to, see what you can see on this network. And the goal of this was really to build the instinct that a lot of people not, when you approach people and they say, oh, I don't really like computers, what they mean is they don't have this instinct whenever they see a problem to go, yeah, I'll just Google that. Or if they have a friend, ask them. So we were trying to build that in them, both so that they could help themselves in the future, and also this very selfish reason of it would be less work for us if they would Google things when they got home and they knew more, right? That's kind of our goal. Over time, we were trying to do less work and make it so the club automated itself so that people would do their own teaching and do their own labs. And that way, it would be this continual loop that we wouldn't have to worry about as much. And so, yeah, we walk around, we help people out, and it seems to be going well for a little bit. Right? It's the core loop. You teach a few basics. You give them the resources to learn more. You inspire them to learn independently. You encourage them to share whatever they learn independently amongst the group. And then you loop until the class no longer relies on you. Great. How do we do that? So, we're going through this, and we do it a few times. And then we quickly realize, wait, we're forgetting something. Feedback? Does anyone know what that is? Like, should we ask the people in our club how they feel about what we're doing? I think we should. So, we've been trying this entire time, but we're dealing with a bunch of engineers and computer science students, and when you have around 70 people, nobody wants to raise their hands and go, hey, I really don't know something. Can you explain it to me? That's really nerve-wracking for pretty much everybody. If you're in a lecture hall, you don't raise your hand and admit that you're an idiot, when in reality, nobody knows the answer probably, and everybody is thinking the same question. So there's a couple ways you can do it. You can use Google Forms. They're anonymous. But the issue is, depending on how early you start trying to extract feedback to see if you're doing well and that your organization is, proceeding and people aren't just showing up to show up because they're students and it looks good on a resume that they are participating in clubs. Oh boy. Early on, they don't know enough to know anything, right? So in our early meetings when we were doing a lot of digital forensics, we go, hey, do you guys want to do crypto, reverse engineering, web exploitation? What do you want to do? And they'd go, well, we don't really know anything enough to say what we like, so can you just pick one? And we go, yeah, I guess, but sure. But so it's really not that helpful to ask for feedback early on. You only get helpful feedback about your public speaking and your ability to present, which is important, but it really depends. And of course, this comes back to the fact that when you have 50 plus people, they're hard to manage. It's hard to extract info from them just because they're the nature of being so many of them and they don't want to speak out. So that means that depending on your use case, around 10 people, that could be the optimal way to go. So there came a point where this realization hit me, and it was that we were around finals, and I had been prepping this meet, and I hadn't really done any prep for a meeting. So what ended up happening is I walked up to the whiteboard in our little lecture hall kind of thing, and I wrote on the board a stack frame, and I wrote buffer, and then I drew an arrow out of it, and I said overflow, and I said, all right, kids, that's a buffer overflow, cool, and then I paused for a second, and I said, you know what, I can do better, and I just started going, and I kept doing this until about 40 minutes in, when I stopped, and I realized I looked like the guy on the left. And I looked at the board, and I looked at what I'd gone over, and I looked at like the demo I'd pulled up on my laptop, and I was like, well, so I just taught you kind of how a buffer overflow attack works, but none of you know assembly, so okay. And then I did a format string vulnerability to override the global offset table, and that was kind of cool, but like, do you know how ELF files work? So I skipped over some steps, but to say the least. But, I give this lecture to say it was kind of haphazard. I ended up adapting it later. A professor was like, hey, come get some new recruits, come talk in my class. And I was like, how does a buffer overflow lecture sound? And he was like, good. And there was a couple members in his class who were also in our club, and they saw me walk in, and they were like, oh God. Thankfully, it was more organized the second time. But the first time through, I did some demos and stuff, but I stopped about 40 minutes in, and I was like, wait a minute, do any of you guys have any questions? And they all kind of like, some of them were taking notes, and they like looked down and were like, and I like looked at one of their notes and was like, well, I can't even interpret your notes. I really don't know what's going on here. I'm sure there's some concepts in there somewhere, but wow, this was disorganized. And I go, yeah, they're like, I just need to parse this a little bit more. So I keep going, and I try to explain myself and fill in some gaps. But they didn't really have that baseline, some of the stuff to fill it in, and they didn't have their laptops, so it's really hard to like do it themselves. But the real issue was, after this whole endeavor happened, I looked over and go, well, how was that? And they're like the guy on the right. They go, that was pretty good. Actually, I feel like I really enjoy your lectures a lot more. I really learn a few more things. Now, if you'll remember, our entire thing was lectures are boring. And we shouldn't do lectures because you're students and you get lectured at all the time. So that's surely a terrible idea, right? And we'd open like every meeting talking about how that was sort of our goal. And then we get down to it, and this is like a finals week, so people are, there aren't that as many people there. And there's like 10 of them, and they go, yeah, actually I really like lectures. I feel like I learn a lot more in them. It's really useful for me. And I go, well, wait, really? Like, why didn't you tell us this? And they're like, I don't know. So what do you mean you don't know? This was our founding principle for how we were running the club, and it was wrong. And so stuff like this just goes to show that there's a lot of situations where it's really hard to get feedback a lot of the time. Now, you might get some more confident people, and as people get older and aren't like 20-year-olds who are self-conscious, they might be a bit more willing to speak out, whether they actually know what they're talking about or not. But this was a real problem. So we decided, okay, let's modify things a bit. So each meeting, we're gonna still do demos, but we want to demonstrate a skill, and then we want to let the students solve it similar to themselves. So take like analyzing a PCAP file or something. Maybe we're doing a CTF problem because that's a really nice example. Maybe we're looking in it for a flag, and you have to like look through like a TCP flow or something like that. And so then you do that. You do it in front of them. You explain what a PCAP file is. You go over all of the networking basics, and then you do the problem and you explain it to them. And then you say, "Okay, kids." Or not kids, they're like my age. But and you go and you give it to them and you say, all right, now figure it out yourselves. And maybe it's a slightly different problem, or maybe it's the exact same thing. But like, for instance, in the buffer overflow example, if any of you have tried to do one, you'll know that knowing theoretically how to do a buffer overflow and actually managing to point something back to your shell code are completely different things and often take quite a bit more work. But the thing is, when you teach these people these skills and you're just lecturing at them, I'm sure many of you have experienced this, there's a big difference between being lectured at and actually having the confidence to go, yeah, I kind of know how this works, I could do this, and I could figure more stuff out on my own. So the issue is, before we were just giving these lectures. But as you help them through it, you give them some time to think about it first. You can walk around, and the feedback will become very obvious as you walk around and you just ask questions about what they're doing and how they work. And that's sort of the nice thing about demos. But before, we were having a lecture and then we were having a demo, they were separate meetings, and people would forget things in between because college, you just dump info into your brain, you spit it out on a test, and then you come out of college knowing very little. And that's the general loop. But the goal here is that the student gains confidence that they can know what they're doing. The student then can, hopefully, in our dreams, contribute to the class and help other students and then run their own meetings. Because, like I said, we asked who knows Linux, who knows how to use a terminal in the first meeting. Like 5 people raised their hands. And those 5 people can go on to help others, It doesn't have to, especially when you have like 70 people, it's very difficult to manage on your own. And if possible, over time, you can eventually pivot to these long lab times, but initially, they don't know enough to do it. So something I found, if we go back all the way back to high school, is when we did CyberPatriot, like I mentioned, we actually took 2nd place nationally. We got very lucky. And when we took 2nd place nationally, we suddenly went from one team of 5 people to 7 teams. So we had like 40 people in our organization of what used to be just 5 close friends, messing around doing a security competition. So suddenly we had to go from, well, we're good at this, to let's try and teach these other 30 people who don't know anything about this how to compete in this competition. And over time, we do our best to teach them, but what we found is we'd get frustrated because they maybe weren't grasping it as easily as some of us did, or so on. But a real key to success that we found is that we made these giant lists that we called battle plans. And what these battle plans were essentially spreadsheets, and spreadsheets that we would research. Like, I think the final copy was like 40 pages. Just for every like Windows service, for every operating system you can imagine, that would be in the competition anyway. Like, here's what the original value is, here's what recommended security setting we have, and here's why. And we spent like countless hours researching all of this and like local security policy, etc. And this was just a cool tool for us, and we could like pretty easily get through like at least the easy parts of the competition. So eventually we'd get frustrated because these people that we were just teaching and were new to it weren't getting it as fast as we wanted, and they weren't doing as well in the competition. So we took our battle plans and we gave them to the new people. And what we found is they'd rely on these battle plans, but they didn't have all of the time that we'd committed into actually learning the material. They were just relying on it as this is gospel, this is my source of knowledge, I'm going to learn from this, as if it was a condensed amount of information. But in reality, we'd learned way more from having to struggle through Googling and the internet to actually condense all of this into what we thought was useful information. So there was a ton of stuff that was just left out. And additionally, because they didn't have to spend all of that time on their own to figure stuff out, they didn't really know it as well. And that just meant that they continued to do poorly, and they used it as more of a crutch when we used it as just a compilation of everything that we'd already learned. So in the end, it really all comes back to confidence. It's the confidence of all of the people that you're teaching to ask questions. It's the confidence in their own ability to go home and learn all of the material. And then the confidence, hopefully, to actually take a leading step, because we all get busy, and go and teach others about cybersecurity, not just in a club format, but also wherever they work, right? Like, if your goal is to make more educated users and can become more an active part of your cybersecurity onion and part of your entire system, just another layer of security, then they need to help everyone else they work with. And it'll just become this chain of people spreading throughout everyone they know, saying this is why security is important and this is why you should care. So for handing it off, you really just need people, assuming you ever want to do it. And I'm sorry for the large amount of 1995 hackers gifs in this presentation, but I really like the movie. And also, it's very fitting with the theme of this conference. So the quality is needed, assuming you want one. You need public speaking. I've been to a lot of college organizations that have inevitably just died because that guy who runs it is really good at programming or is really smart, But if their public speaking skills aren't really up to par, then trying to convince and exchange all of that information is not going to go very well. And eventually they'll give up because college students or students in general, honestly, everybody is really snippety with their time, and it's difficult to convince them that it's a worthwhile time investment, which is really what you're trying to do because you're gaining something from giving them this knowledge. And of course, Google Foo, what a lot of the people in our club, especially the first couple of semesters, really didn't understand is that they go, wow, you're so smart in all this material. Look at all these things you know. Yeah, so like the club started at 6 p.m. and at noon, we would start Googling frantically and we would be pretty good at a material 6 hours later. And that was how our meetings worked. And then, of course, a general understanding of a lot of security concepts because, in general, going too deep into one subject is going to be a lot harder, especially if you're trying to catch up new members. It would just be very difficult to do. So going broad is generally a better approach. So in conclusion, start slow. You don't want to scare everybody off. It's certainly easy to do, but I recommend trying your best not to do so. And yeah, it's like, definitely just think back to the times when you were in their footsteps and their age, assuming you weren't hacking when you were like 12 or 14 or something, which I'm sure is a lot of you. But, let the students figure it out on their own. If you coach them through it the entire time and just let them do it, they're not going to be much more than script kiddies when it comes down to it. You really need to let them figure it out on their own and understand the concepts very well, and then they'll do it themselves. Persistence across students is very difficult to manage. In an actual organization with adults, this might be a little bit easier, but with students, often you'll lose a ton of membership between semesters, and that's sort of how it is. People get busy, people commit to other things, maybe they have leadership roles in other organizations, they're trying to pad out their resume and graduate. People are full-time students. Which means that inevitably you're going to have to reteach a lot of the material over again. And if going through like over the wire bandit and teaching bash a couple times just kills your soul, be careful. It did mine. And it's really easy to burn out when doing this. In fact, we found it, part of the reason why we were so insistent on trying to hand it off is because we were really worried about this. We were worried about burning out because we'd be teaching these same basics. Sometimes we'd even use the same slide decks semester after semester because people didn't know it. It was important for them to learn it, but there comes a point where, ideally as students, right, we didn't, hopefully, know that much more than them. We had a couple years or summers of internships that we were building off of, and we had these competitions we were competing in, but really we want to be learning a lot of material right along with them. And if you're running a security organization, that's realistic. People bring all sorts of different viewpoints, and that's very important for security. But if you're teaching the same thing over and over again, it's really easy to burn out. And of course, I've been kind of harping on this the entire time. Security is really important for everybody to learn because, in an ideal world, you don't have, you'll still have things like pen testers and incident response, but you don't have these big security teams. You have hackers and then the people who are doing their jobs because everybody's security conscious and they can think things thoroughly. And that's, of course, very idealistic and not how the world actually works currently. But, we can all dream. And by encouraging people to actually learn security concepts, a lot more can be done there. So resources we are using, overthewire.org is useful for teaching bash fundamentals. Over the Wire also has a lot of different, it's a war game site, so it can teach you a lot of fundamentals and get progressively hard. Pico-CTF, CTF Time are good for CTF clubs, which, as you get better and you teach more security concepts, people might become interested in these. And hey, maybe you can make some money. We actually went to a competition and placed second one year, and then those guys graduated, so then there were just two of us again who were interested. But it really is up to you and the kind of audience that you can make. We use VoneHub for pre-made images. If you're interested in doing web exploitation, a lot of these kind of old, but DVWA, Metodai, Hack the Site, all good resources for teaching people. And, Google everything else, because it's all out there. We live in a computer field. Everything's online. So let's see. Went a little fast, but that's okay. Does anybody have any questions? If not, feel free to contact me afterwards. There's my Twitter. Feel free to ping me online. But, yeah. Any have any questions? Yep. Okay. Cool. Thanks, everybody.